Welcome to the Contrarian Capitalist podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Jay Martin, President and CEO of Cambridge House International, and also the host of the very popular Jay Martin Show on YouTube. Jay, welcome to the Contrarian Capitalist.
Robert, it's great to be here.
Plenty to talk about, and I know we were just saying off air that the aim of what we're going to do today is look at natural resources through the lens of geopolitics. So we're going to put everything together. I'm sure we'll mention Canada as well in due course. There's a lot going on over in the east with China, Taiwan, etc. There's also a lot going on to over in the west here with between the USA, Cuba, Russia, Venezuela. So pick a place where you'd like to start and let's dive into what's going on.
I like how when you mentioned the Caribbean, you didn't leave it at Venezuela. You right away mentioned Cuba and Russia, which I think is that real headline that almost nobody is paying attention to. Because when you look at what's occurring in the Caribbean right now, the US has just assembled the largest concentration of military power in over 30 years in the Caribbean. And apparently, it's because the president of Venezuela is involved in the drug trade. Apparently, it's because he stole an election. Apparently, it's because the Venezuelan people are oppressed. And while all three of those things are true, none of those things are unique to Venezuela. And we'll find many of those things inside countries that we're happy to do business with, right? Saudi Arabia being a great example. There's no democracy there. There's no elections. Journalists just disappear if they disagree with the crown prince. This has been proven, yet they're a business partner, right? When you look at the drug trade in Venezuela, again, there's no empirical evidence that they contribute meaningfully at all to the American drug problem. At best, they're a jump-off point between South America and Europe, not America. The fentanyl crisis in the States is nothing to do with Venezuela. The precursors come from China, and they're transported through Mexico. So there's actually no substance to this line behind why Maduro needs to go, other than there's tons of oil there. Obviously, this is the one point that kind of lasts. And it's still a curious one because Maduro has openly said, open access, whatever deal you want to do for our natural resources, we can do it. He's come to the table and put everything out there, right? No options are closed. Yet that hasn't been enough. And still, we're seeing this massive concentration of military power in the Caribbean. Now, I don't think Venezuela is no part of that conversation, but it's a much smaller part than people understand because if the Venezuela thesis doesn't make sense, then what could make sense? What's the real story, right? The American president is brilliant at the head fake, the Kansas City shuffle. You look left, I go right. This is his practice. He's very good at it. And so when you think about this situation, we're all looking at Venezuela. What else could be going on in the region that we're not paying attention to? And there's a few things you need to know about this part of the world. Number one is that it is the most concentrated concentrated area of American economic activity that you could possibly imagine. So, the Gulf of Mexico, just to the north of the Caribbean, is where the Mississippi River meets the ocean. And the Mississippi watershed is the largest unobstructed waterway in the world. And every year, about 500 million tons of American goods float down this river to the Gulf of Mexico. Empires have always been built on rivers. The Egyptian Empire built on the Nile, Rome on the Tiber, Mesopotamian empires built on the Tigris and Euphrates, Russia on the Volga, Germany on the Rhine, etc. And the Mississippi is the modern example of this. And people may think, oh, those were ancient civilizations. Rivers don't matter like they used to. They certainly do. As mentioned, over 500 million tons of agriculture, pharmaceutical, chemical products float down that river every single year because although rivers move slow, you can transport goods down a river at about a tenth of the cost compared to road or rail. And that is how America has maintained relevancy as a global agricultural exporter because of how convenient this river system is. And all the contributing rivers, the Ohio, the Tennessee, the Arkansas, these major watersheds all flood into the Mississippi. 47% of continental USA drains into the Mississippi River. That just means all of that economic value ends up in one spot, right? Louisiana, the Gulf. So it's an incredibly vulnerable part of the country. But in addition, in that Gulf, you'll also find 47% of America's refining capability, right? 20% of oil production, 100% of LNG refinement. And so this is like the most concentrated network of economic value, all squished within 200 nautical miles. Arguably the most highly concentrated economic wealth in the Western Hemisphere for sure, and probably the world, right? And this is just north of the Caribbean, right? This is where all the military activities being built up. And so, this military buildup began in August. And if we look just a few months earlier to try to see what might have happened right before it that could have inspired this, if not Venezuela, you'll see a defense pact that was signed between Cuba and Russia in March and then ratified by the State Duma in Russia. Shortly thereafter, in June, Russian warships and submarines arrived in Cuban waters just 90 miles from the Florida Keys. Now, this is not an indication that Russia is going to strike mainland America. That's not at all the speculation, but they don't need to. There's a few points on the globe where these massive constrictions exist in relation to the economic activity that flows through them, right? One is the South China Sea, right? This is China's access to the world, but it's blocked by Taiwan and the Philippines. They have to get through those two islands in order to access the global market. The second is the Persian Gulf. All of OPEC's output has to slide through the, 50-mile Suez Canal, right? And Iran doesn't have to attack the Suez Canal or the Persian Gulf to obstruct the oil trade. They just have to threaten to, and insurance premiums skyrocket and the global energy market is disrupted. And that's the same tactic that Russia has access to with this partnership with Cuba. And so if you're inside the mind of the American president and you see defense pacts being signed between one of your greatest adversaries and the cork in between, the bottle of American economic activity and the rest of the world market, you're going to be concerned. When you see military activity begin to increase in the form of cruise ships and submarines, you're going to respond to that, and you're going to send a very strong message. And so, it's a rolling development, but one that is getting no press coverage. Everybody is focused on Venezuela, but there's much more going on in the region. And if you were going to strike or try to disrupt American activity, that is absolutely the one spot you would go to do it. The chips are in place, and sometimes that's enough, right? What I think about when I analyze this, though, is that if we've all been head faked to look at Venezuela when the real item being dealt with is sort of under the surface around Cuba, there's always a couple head fakes happening at once. And signing a defense pact with Cuba, sending a couple warships is a great head fake to get the Americans to look one way while something else is happening somewhere else. Because if your attention is focused here, the rest of the world is, up for grabs, so to speak. And so, that's the geopolitical chess game that's being played right now. And that's how it relates to the Caribbean from my perspective.
How do you think then? I mean, we could talk about how the media frames things, etc. I mean, that's probably a whole different conversation, but touch on that if you want to. So, how do you think this plays out? If everyone's looking one way and something's happening in the other direction, run me through your process. What do you think is likely to happen moving forward in this particular region?
Yeah, I think this makes agendas easier for China within the South China Sea. China is the world's second largest economy, but it doesn't have access to the open ocean. Now, you could look at the country and say, what are you talking about? It's got a big coastline, but that coastline is protected by other countries that China needs to have good relations with in order to access that global market. And so if there's an agenda being run, maybe to change the dynamic in Taiwan, in the South China Sea, to give Americans something else to focus on so the United States can withdraw from the Ukrainian war. Things like this are probably what's going to happen, right? When everyone's looking left, something happens over on the right. And, I think President Trump is looking for an outs in Europe. I think he's made that very clear. I think he'd rather do business with Russia than be an enemy.
Mhm.
And so if he can distract the American public's attention and get them less focused on the outcome in Europe and focused on a greater threat somewhere closer to home, that's in his best interest if that's the agenda. And so, you take the pressure off one region, add it to somewhere else, you can now move a bit more freely in that region that's less exposed.
That certainly makes a lot of sense. And I think that just talking about the Mississippi and Louisiana there, I think you mentioned this earlier on. Not that this would happen because it would create absolute chaos, but if people wanted to, and not get revenge on China, but play a political card with them, closing that Malacca Strait would be straight up there. I'm not saying that people should go out and do that, 'cause that's probably not a good thing. But that, just to put it in comparison to what, if the shoe was on the other foot, so to speak.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And that's the ASEAN region, right? Those Southeast Asian countries that make up 800 million people, probably the most valuable future consumer base in the world, most favorable demographics, emerging economies, big populations, very valuable countries.
In terms of natural resources, then, if we start to, twine this in, obviously, China's responsible for a lot of natural resources. The USA are, I think, out and about doing various deals at the moment. There's this nuclear push going on. With everything that we've just discussed, how does that potentially shape the future of the variety of resources?
Well, I think that the big shift in the natural resource sector is that we are moving from an era that has defined my entire life for the last 40 years, which has been the era of globalization. This was an era where if you had the cash or the credit, you could buy whatever you wanted from whoever had it. This was an open marketplace. That's how the world functioned. That era is absolutely over. What happens next, I think, is far less clear. I don't think it's predictable, and I don't think it's going to happen fast, but it will be different. And in the interim, what that means is that we have far less certainty over supply of the critical materials we need to sustain our economies. And that is why nations all over the world are suddenly turning their attention to the natural resource sector. Now, keep in mind, this is an industry that was vilified for the last 15 years from every developed nation's politicians. This is not something they wanted anything to do with. They wanted the extraction industries to be in somebody else's country, just not theirs. That's the not in my backyard argument. And this is the pivot we've seen from the establishments in every developed nation, Canada, US, Europe, Australia, et cetera, because we're now in this new era where it doesn't matter if you have the cash or the credit, there's more at stake. There's more to be negotiated than just buying what you want. And obviously, the big headline today is still the China rare earth element and their validated end user program, which means they're willing to sell rare earths, the rare earths that the United States needs, but they're going to qualify who can buy them and what they can be used for. And this is how America has done trade for 20, 30 years, but now it's being spun back on them in this new era of deglobalization. And so go ahead, Rob.
No, 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 no. I was just
No.
nodding in agreement, Jay.
All right. Yeah. I mean, the other symptoms of this are like you look at the critical metals list in the US, right? These are the metals that they deem critical to their prosperity and survival. And this number has been steadily ticking up for years now. There was only 35 materials on this list in 2018. There's 60 today. At this rate, we're going to have the whole periodic table on the critical metals list in short order, right? But it just speaks to the insecurity over supply, right? And, in response to that, we're seeing the American government become an active investor now in the mining sector. And not just the mining sector, but, this started with the Nippon Steel, US Steel merger that initially President Trump blocked and then he approved, but in exchange secured the US government a golden share in US Steel, which gives them extraordinary veto power inside that organization. So this is now, sort of a state capitalist company now because the US government has a tremendous amount of veto power over how they can operate. They're a 10% shareholder in Intel now, a 15% shareholder in MP Materials, right? The largest shareholder of this new rare earth miner and refiner in the United States. And the deals keep on going. I think 10% equity stake in Lithium Americas, 5% in US Antimony, 10% in Trilogy Metals. This is a critical metal project up in Alaska. And this is interesting because we've never seen this kind of activity in the West with this sort of cadence. this state capitalism model has always been very distasteful to Westerners, right? We're a free market capitalist society. The government has no place in our business. That's what China does. That's true. That's what China did for the last 30 years. And they did it really, really effectively to the degree that now they are absolutely indispensable to every major economy and major technology company in the world because of what they manufacture. And we've all woken up to our dependency on that. The United States government has also woken up to the fact that they need to correct course and they can't wait for private markets to do it on their own. And so they need to subsidize and step in with their checkbook. But it's more than just their checkbook. If you look at the Trilogy Metals deal up in Alaska, this is a high quality critical metal deposit. But the obstruction was that there's no road access to this. You could only fly in, which made the project uneconomic. It wouldn't make any sense to actually build a mine because the cost of getting that material back to an economy somewhere. Right after the United States government wrote a check for about $35 million to buy an equity stake, they then coordinated the Bureau of Land Management to get the road built, the Ambler Road, a multi-billion-dollar road that gives you access to this deposit. And so, there's this new activist investor at the table. They're not just writing big checks, but they have the ability to move policy. And we're going to see a lot of this. That's why we've extended the critical metals list from 35 to 60 to give American government the breadth to step in and justifiably say, we're going to step in with our wallet and our policy muscle to make this go forward because we need secure supply over the things we don't have secure supply of anymore. And this is the new geopolitical reality, right? We've fractured the chessboard. We don't know who's friends with who's allies with who's adversaries with who. It's all being reshuffled and being reshuffled very, very quickly. And so in the meantime, there's a scramble for developed nations to take, regain, or get control over resources they need to build the economies they've promised their populations for the future.
I find it fascinating how that geopolitical landscape has shifted because I can't sit here and agree with everything that China does, but I always say that China's got the ability to play chess whilst everyone else is playing checkers because of the way that it's politically set up. One party control, we can think in 20, 30-year terms. Whereas over here, of course, it's completely different. So I find that fascinating when you're going through that, how the tables have turned, so to speak. And, it's almost like I say a lot of the West, we'll get on to Canada, maybe the UK in a bit, but most of the West is waking up going, well, hang on a minute, we need to do something here.
And you're absolutely right. The beauty of democracy is that we get to choose our leaders frequently. The downside to that is that we incentivize our leaders to give us short-term promises because they want to deliver within 2 to 4 years. And anybody who's accomplished anything great in their life knows that it takes a lot longer than you want it to get done, and it requires short-term pain and sacrifice. That's a guarantee. But no democratically elected politician is going to win by getting to the podium and promising the population that they're going to make life really hard for 5 or 6 or 7 years. Things are going to get really tough. We're going to have to cut back massive austerity measures. But trust me, 8 or 9 years down the road, this is all going to be worth it. And we will emerge as one of the most prosperous nations in the world. No one's going to vote for that. And if they do vote for that, they're not going to re-elect that candidate 4 years later when they're in the depths of that pain. It's not going to happen, right? We're going to elect a politician who says, I can make your life better next year, right? Which is not a realistic promise, but we elect those people, right? That's the downside to the democratic system, which I would still argue is better than the alternatives, but it's not perfect for that reason, right? Whereas, as you mentioned, China plans in 5-year cycles, and they are about to launch their 15th 5-year plan in 2026. So this began right after the revolution of the People's Republic of China in 1951. And they've launched a 5-year plan every 5 years. There's maybe one break during the Civil War, but this is like a 5-year plan. And the second 5-year plan, so the next 5 year, it's actually a 10-year plan. There's 5 years of concrete goals and then 5 years of speculative goals in every announcement, right? So it's a 10-year agenda with 5-year measurable targets. That's how you scale into the long term when you're a massive organization like a country, right? You need to have that incredible foresight. And that's central planning. We don't like that word, and I understand why, right? I want the government nowhere near my business. Absolutely. I think their efficiency when it comes to operations is like somebody trying to land an airplane using a sledgehammer. They just swing at things. And yeah, the plane will come down, right? But you're probably all going to die. It's not the best practice, right? And so, I'm a free market guy. This is how I like to operate my life, my business. Two things about that. Number one, nobody cares. The government is coming to our businesses in a big way in the West now because their biggest competitor has been doing that and it's been working out for them, right? And so now the US is going to try to mimic that strategy to keep up. The reason I'm not so sure it's going to work is because you can apply the tactics without having the strategy, and it won't actually. This is like an entrepreneur at the beginning of their journey, right? They look at their peers and the entrepreneurs they want to be like, and they look at what they're doing. What did they do last year? What are they doing this year? And then they mimic those things. They mimic the tactics, but they haven't thought about the 5-year strategy. The tactics don't actually align with anything. And so right now we're writing checks, subsidizing mining companies. We're pushing regulation around. We're making promises of reshoring key industries without really a plan to do so. We're doing these massive military rollouts when we can't buy the ingredients to purchase to build more military equipment. Like very short term thinking, large on tactics, light on strategy, and that's what I'm seeing. And it's a symptom of the system that I prefer, but it's far from perfect. I think people just need to, spend less time focused on what politicians can do for them and take accountability and move their own ball forward.
That's something I would totally agree with, and I think most people listening would agree with that level of accountability as well, Jay. Just quickly on while we're on the US, I imagine that's also why the midterms next year are critical because if they are able to continue to do what they're doing and then improve their position in the House and the Senate, that obviously that bodes well for the midterms, and that very likely bodes well for 2028, which then bodes well through to 2030. So at least if that were to work in the Republicans' favor, at least there'd be a little bit of consistency there in the USA over the next few years. I imagine that would likely pay dividends, but I'm not a forecaster, but I imagine it's important that the Republicans maintain control.
I think you're right. I think you're right. And look, I don't agree with lots of what President Trump is doing, but I think he's been the most productive president that the country's had in many years. And if left to fulfill some of his goals, some will be positive, some will be negative, but you can actually see the agenda roll out, right? And I think he will go for a third term. Like I'm quite confident in that, and he hasn't said it publicly, but his partners have, right? Steve Bannon has come out and said we're going to find legal grounds. And I don't think they're hard to find, to be honest, because term limits are not in the Constitution. They're like the 17th Amendment, right? Not the first, the second, the third. Like, you know, America didn't have term limits a lot longer than it's had term limits. FDR won 4 elections, and so by definition, term limits are anti-democratic, right? If the population wants to elect the same person 4 or 5 times, shouldn't they be allowed to do that? And if that candidate's so atrocious, then just beat them at the polls. Like that should be how a democracy functions. And so I think there is grounds to be made. Media is going to go crazy over that when if a third term is announced. You can just imagine, right, what's going to happen. People won't look at history. They won't look at the fact that America didn't have term limits until the 50s, I believe. Maybe it was the 40s, but it was right around there. They'll just look at like what can we sensationalize right now in this moment and blow it up, right? But I agree with you. I think, right now you can't pendulum hard left, hard right, hard left, hard right every 4 to 8 years and expect to stay relevant in what is now a much more competitive geopolitical landscape than we had over the last 40 years.
Well, as you said earlier on, especially as the amount of progress that China's made as well, and other countries do have significant levels of resources as well, you need to be at least, at the table playing rather than taking a step back. Talking of, well, let's move north of the border then, Jay. So for those that are not aware, you are, Canadian, you are from Canada. I am from England. I'm sure we've got a lot in common, i.e. Mark Carney. What is going on? What's going on up there? Give us about 10% of the audience are Canadian. So I can't lay claim to know much about what's going on in Canada. So the floor's all yours, energy-wise, resource-wise. What's going on up there?
Well, here's what I'll say is that Canada is a very, very simple country. And when it's managed properly, has the potential to be one of the wealthiest on a per capita basis in the world. And the evidence of that is recent history. If you look at the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, Canada came through with a healthier balance sheet than any other G7 nation because we had leadership that managed the country properly. And all that means is that Canada has one core industry that we do extraordinarily well, and that's the natural resource sector. 30% of the world's potash. If you want to grow anything, you need potash. 25% of the world's hardwood lumber, right? Nickel, lithium, oil, gas, uranium, the richest deposits in the world. You name it, Canada's got your back from a resource standpoint. But that industry was vilified for the last 12 years under the Trudeau establishment. And so we shut it down and we tried to lean into other sectors. But if you have one sort of rainmaker sector and you let that sector thrive, then capital can trickle into all the ancillary and adjacent industries, and everybody can thrive because your rainmaker is prospering. But if you handcuff the rainmaker, if you regulate it out of relevance and tax it to death, then there's no capital to flow around. And that's why today Canada's in the exact opposite position. And if you look at like GDP per capita, we're pretty much parallel to Alabama. So all the talk about the 51st state, if Canada were to become the 51st state, it'd be the third poorest in the United States on a per capita basis, per capita to GDP, GDP to per capita. So, I think we're correcting course. And, I didn't vote for Mark Carney, but I've got to be honest, I'm pleasantly surprised by many of his decisions. The Special Projects Office, he's pushing resource projects forward, very similar to what we're seeing in the United States, political support for the extraction industry. Now, Canada's got all the potential in the world because it's so resource rich, and we share the longest border in the world, on the other side of which is the world's wealthiest and hungriest customer. But in addition, the longest coastline in the world, access to every global market. Any talk of, Carney's goal to triple non-US exports in the next 5 years is a fantastic goal. Any plans to decouple from the United States, that's fallacy. You would never do that. It's never going to be more cost effective to trade with anybody else when you can just let products fall across the border. And that's why $2 billion worth of goods every single day cross the Canada-US border. That shouldn't go anywhere. We should protect that. It's very important to Canada's well-being. But should we open up optionality? Like 100% we should. And so we're beginning to see some of that. The goal to 5x the military spend in the next 10 years, I think also very important because trade routes must be protected, and we have the longest coastline in the world. It's thawing. It is, right? And the northern passageway between effectively Canada and Russia is opening up, and more ships are passing through, and none of them are Canadian. And so, we're seeing a lot of initiatives right now to build out the Arctic, and I think that's very smart. I've been pessimistic on Canada for the majority of the last 8 years. And I started divesting from the country. And for me, what that looks like is divesting my time. I've got 3 young kids. I've got a 4th on the way. And we started spending an increased amount of time outside of the country, just looking for let's spend a month in Mexico, a month in Southeast Asia. And this became more and more of our life until last year we withdrew our kids from the Canadian school system and enrolled them in Indonesia, where we were living. And, my businesses are still here in Canada. I have real estate here, but, you can divest a number of ways. And we just wanted to begin building optionality in case Canada didn't correct course, because a country can have all the right ingredients and still make the wrong choices at the poll and throw it all away. And Argentina is such a great example of this, because Argentina was one of the wealthiest countries in the world 100 years ago. Very active agriculture industry, rich with natural resources, long coastline to export this to the global market. And they did, and it worked extraordinarily well. And globally, there was a term that people were familiar with called the wealthy Argentinian. Right? It was just known as a wealthy country no matter where you went. Nobody in my generation would think of Argentina that way, right? They got crushed by the Great Depression like everybody else, but what they did was elect a socialist government who promised them to intervene and rectify all the pain caused by the Depression. Now, governments can't do that, so they made the problem worse. And this cost them 80 years of productivity. They had all the right ingredients. If managed properly, never should have happened, but they made the wrong choice at the poll, and it cost them nearly 100 years of productivity. They're just now getting their feet back under them, right? And it's going to be a battle. It's going to be a battle. So that's always a potential option, right? And if that ends up being what happens in Canada, I just want to make sure we have a foothold elsewhere. My wife's American, my kids are dual. So, we always have the option of just going stateside. But for a handful of reasons, I'm looking more internationally. And so we put down roots in Indonesia for the last 3 years. We've been going there. We spent 4 months there this year, and it's just good to have the options. I'm not giving up on Canada, right? But I'm hedging my bets. Absolutely.
Something I think most people again would agree with. It's important to have that plan B and important to have that thing in place just in case things don't quite work out. Similar reasons why I'm not in England at the moment. I mean, Europe's a whole different story, and I'm sure that Canadian trade might be quite excited by what's happening in Europe because there could be a lot of potential there to trade with or send stuff over to Europe. But a similar decision, so we're singing from the same hymn sheet, I think, Jay. Sticking on Canada then, so you said that you're quite impressed with what Mark Carney's done so far. I just want to ask briefly on Alberta, because again, I know when he was elected, there was rumblings of Alberta might want to go independent. Again, I'm not going to lay claim to I know much about that, but I'd like to get a Canadian's perspective of Alberta and what's going on there, if that's okay.
I think that was very effective pressure. And I think movements like that are very important. And I think the Premier, Danielle Smith, was brilliant in the way she executed that. I don't think there's a majority of Albertans that are sincere in wanting to emancipate themselves from Canada, but it is absolutely the obligation of provincial leaders to apply that pressure if needed to our federal leaders. I mean, there has been under the Trudeau administration a ton of federal creep into provincial business. And so for your American viewers, the beauty of America from an outsider standpoint is the sovereignty of the states on a state by state basis. They're remarkably independent from federal decisions. Not all federal decisions, not as many as they used to be, but still a lot. And, during 2020 and 2021, I actually traveled a lot in the States. And it was like every time I crossed the state border, an entirely new environment, the way they were dealing with the situation in 2020, 2021. And I loved that freedom and that choice because you could really choose your own adventure. No matter how you were feeling about something, you could find a state that relates to that and proceeds accordingly. Canada has a lot less of that and a lot less of it today than we did 10 years ago. And so we've seen, the Alberta Sovereignty Act was the seeds of the Separation Act that we heard more about last year. But the Alberta Sovereignty Act was tabled 2-3 years ago. And right parallel to that was the Saskatchewan First Act, which got far less coverage, but it was exactly the same thing. It was the center provinces, which are the hub for Canadian economic activity, saying we're not being respected, right? Our taxes are being allocated to living expenses in Ontario and Ottawa and Quebec. This is not fair. We far over contribute, and we're not being respected for that. And so something needs to change. I don't think the separatist conversation was sincere, but the pressure was effective and it worked. And so I do think, absent that, I don't know if we'd see the same pivot from our federal leadership standpoint toward favoring the extraction industry. So we hadn't seen the extraction provinces begin to apply that pressure. And so, that's how a democracy should function. You should raise your voice. You should make an argument. You should be heard and maybe create change. And that's what's happening. So that's how I read that situation, Robert.
And then one more question on Canada before we could quickly go elsewhere around the world. So just with regards to Mark Carney, and you said obviously you mentioned the borders and the access in terms of coastline that Canada has as well. So what else is, pardon the pun, what else is in the pipeline for Mark Carney to achieve moving forward?
Oh boy. He's announced a very audacious budget, $80 billion deficit, which is crazy in that when Justin Trudeau was elected, he announced a $10 billion budget and it just floored Canada. We couldn't imagine a $10 billion deficit. And here we are, 8x that today. Now, the promises behind this excessive spending is that it will be spent intelligently into economic infrastructure. And I wanted to spend a minute on that because it's actually really important, right? You can run a deficit federally if the money's allocated properly. And you can look at, let's go back to China as a great example of this. Over the last 30 years, China accumulated about $41 trillion in debt. But what they did with that money was build the most specialized economic and manufacturing zones that the world has ever seen. And they're so effective because they built the refineries right beside the component makers, right beside the transport, the heavy rail, or the deep water ports. And this allowed them to produce anything at much higher efficiency and at reduced cost compared to anywhere else in the world. That $41 trillion is a lot of debt, but it was spent very intelligently. Over that same time period, the last 30 years, the United States has borrowed $31 trillion. They spent that money funding foreign wars that they lost, bailing out banks for fraud, and funding stimulus programs that were largely spent on buying goods manufactured in China. Inefficient debt versus efficient debt. And so that's the promise we're hearing from the Canadian government today, is that this is going to be a very expensive budget, but it's going to be worth it. There's no way to assess how substantive that is except time. We just have to wait and see. The promises look good. Once again, like I didn't vote for the guy, but I think anything would have been a drastic improvement from Trudeau. So here we are. I think he's doing the right things in many ways. But like I said, I don't agree with any politician wholeheartedly. And but that's the read I have right now, is that we are hearing promises to run a tremendous deficit, but invest that in productive assets. And if that's the case, could turn out that my kids have a great life and my grandkids have a great life of opportunity here in Canada. But we'll have to wait and see.
Well, that also links into what we were saying about Western politics earlier on, looking at the USA, that if everything's chopping and changing every 2, 3, 4 years, you're not really going to get anywhere. So I'm hoping from what you've told me, it sounds like that this idea is really good and there's a lot of potential, obviously, with the resources that you have over in Canada. But it also sounds like if the same party could be in power for 5 or 10 years, for example, then actually then you'll start to see those seeds come to fruition.
Yeah, absolutely. And right now, Mark Carney has no competition. The Conservative Party of Canada is still pushing Pierre Poilievre. I don't know why, but that's their decision. And Poilievre always really confused me during the campaign. It more confused me why people became so obsessed with him. Incredibly charismatic, incredibly witty. It was super fun watching him dance around reporters. Very entertaining, but you had to spend 5 minutes doing diligence on this guy to see that a person who self-describes as a libertarian but has never had a job outside of politics is obviously a liar. Like that's the whole story there, right? And so, I at the time I was like, despite all that, he's going to be the better choice between him and Trudeau. That's the direction the country has to go. When Trudeau ceded power and Mark Carney took over, Carney ran an effective strategy. It annoyed me at the time, but he convinced Canadians that he wasn't running against Pierre Poilievre. He convinced Canadians that he was running against Donald Trump. Every one of his speeches, all the debates, all the messaging was that me over Trump, me versus Trump. Poilievre never even entered the conversation and very quickly just disappeared into irrelevance. And, it was a savvy strategy and it worked, right? But at present, Carney does not have an opposition leader because Poilievre is not the guy and he's not going to regain the public's trust. There was a moment in time where that personality was resonating. It was on the heels of disastrous management during 2020 through to 2023 of a lot of those issues. And here was a guy who offered an alternative. Canadians wanted it. But he's not the global leader. The guy's a career politician, and I think that's where it begins and ends. So at present, Carney's got nobody in the way. I hope that changes, right? Like I definitely do, but I'd like to see somebody from private business who's already made their money enter politics, not somebody who came up in politics, try to keep their job. Those are two very different things. One's disastrous, one's better than the alternative.
Before we touch upon the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference, I'd like to give you the opportunity to mention that. We've gone around the world a little bit today. We've looked at Canada, looked at the USA, looked at the Caribbean, China, etc. Are there any other geopolitical flashpoints or areas that you want to bring to the listeners' attention before we wrap up with talking about Vancouver?
No, I think, it's a moving target right now. And, when we spoke earlier about how it's really tough to read what the geopolitical chessboard will look like in as short a period of time as like 5 years, there's evidence of that all over the world, right? And there's a competition occurring very clearly between the United States economy and the economy of China. And many countries are trying to figure out how to play that game. And for as long as they can, they're going to try and stay neutral. And, there's countries like Canada that are claiming neutrality, but in reality, they're married to the United States just from a geographic standpoint and an economic one. It's just a better choice. Countries like Southeast Asia trying to thread the needle, but from a proximity standpoint, they're actually more aligned with China. And we're going to have to see how that shakes out in the future. But countries like Australia kind of sit on the middle ground, right? They're militarily aligned with the West, but economically aligned with the East. And from a proximity standpoint, more aligned with the East. And, despite Donald Trump's threats of, 100% tariffs on any countries that do business outside of US dollars, just a month and a half ago, Australia started doing business outside of US dollars, right? When all those rare earth headlines began to emerge at the end of September, the headlines that didn't get any coverage were that simultaneously, after announcing the rare earth restrictions, China made a different announcement. They were no longer going to buy iron ore from BHP in US dollars. Now, they weren't halting purchases, they were just halting purchases in US dollars. And China is BHP's biggest customer. They import about $70 billion worth of iron ore every year because China is the world's #1 steel manufacturer. You can't make steel without iron. And so if your biggest customer makes a claim like that, you come to the table, you find out what's going on. And where they landed was that in the future, China would be able to purchase its iron ore shipments in 70% US dollars and 30% renminbi. And so, the real significance of this news event is a fewfold. Number one, Australia is not Vietnam, it's not Indonesia, or it's not a BRICS nation like Brazil or India, right? They're a G7 adjacent country. They're a Western allied nation that is now doing business in renminbi. And BHP is the world's largest commodity company in the world. And so this gives the Chinese precedent to go anywhere else on the globe and say, when we want to, we do business in renminbi. And it was good enough for BHP, so it's definitely going to be good enough for you. And they're right. It's a very strong argument. And in addition, BHP is now collecting renminbi in exchange for their sales. Billions, tens of billions of dollars per year. They now have to find a place for that renminbi, right? They could just convert it to US dollars and maintain business as usual. But as any non-business owner, non-US business owner knows, exchange risk is a real thing. It's a headache. It's expensive. It's inconvenient. And so, exchanging renminbi into US dollars in tens of billions doesn't make any sense. And so more likely, they'll just find a provider who accepts renminbi. So BHP is now incentivized to see more of the world de-dollarize so they can put their treasury of renminbi to productive use. And, these are events that occur. We tend to look at them as like, oh, that event happened. This deal got done. But it's never that. It's always precedent and trajectory. That's what this really symbolizes. A new precedent was set with Australia, BHP, and renminbi. And this sets a new trajectory of what's possible in the future. And guaranteed, we're going to see more of that, right? And so there's a country like Australia trying very hard to thread the needle, right? Saudi Arabia being another one, right? The massively wealthy country, huge resources. If anybody could play neutrality, it's Saudi Arabia, right? And we're seeing them, though, lean certain ways after the Israelis bombed Qatar in Doha, maybe a month and a half ago, right? This was the headline that we all saw, right? And, a Qatari national had never been bombed inside the country ever before. So it was big news, but there was no recourse by the Israeli strategic partner being the Americans. And Saudi Arabia, next door neighbor, watched this outcome. They watched a country, Qatar, who 6 months earlier, all the headlines were about how Qatar is going to gift a $400 million airplane to President Trump. We're best friends. This is the direction we're going. And then this happens, right? Nationals get bombed in Doha and the US says nothing about it. And this makes all of Qatar's neighbors pick up their head and start asking questions. And a month later, 2 weeks later, Saudi Arabia signed a defense pact, but it was with Pakistan, the only nuclear-armed Muslim-majority country in the world. And Pakistan obviously got that nuclear technology from China, which puts Saudi Arabia de facto under China's nuclear umbrella. And this is the big shift because back to the last 40-year trend, it's been the petrodollar era, right? We transact in US dollars, oil from Saudi Arabia, and in exchange, Saudi Arabia gets protection from America. And that protection has now pivoted. Now, the petrodollar agreement's obviously been over for a minute, technically, but practically, it's now fully over. And so these are the developments that we're seeing happen every single month. Major economies having to make tough decisions about who they're aligned with. That's why it's so difficult to determine what the geopolitical chessboard is going to look like in as short a time period as 5 years. So if you don't like geopolitics today, like pick a new sport because there's never going to be more going on than we're watching in present day.
Yeah, it's a very interesting space to be in. I look forward to our hopefully round two next year, Jay, when we can see what's going on at that time. Now, I mentioned a little while ago about the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference. I'm pretty sure most listeners will be very au fait with it, but again, please do tell the audience, when it is, what to expect, and a little bit more about it in general, please.
Well, for anybody who's interested in investing in the mining sector, that's what the VRIC is for. It's the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference, January 25th and 26th in Vancouver. And I'm flying in about 110 keynote speakers. We have 6 stages. It's like the Super Bowl of junior mining investment. And so everybody on stage is somebody that we've hand selected who has an amazing track record of allocating capital into the mining sector. They take the stage to share with you where they're putting their cash in 2026 and beyond. It's a 2-day agenda packed with panel discussions, fireside chats, debates, and keynote speeches. And we really cover the sector from the absolute top down to the most specific topics we could think of, which means we start at geopolitics, we then cover macro, and then we get into capital allocation in the mining companies themselves. We expect around 11,000 investors this year, and there will be about 300 mining companies exhibiting in the trade show. So these are companies with active projects all over the world that come to Vancouver to connect with prospective or existing shareholders and explain their business case and what their plans are with your capital, should they receive it. If you want to learn, you want to connect, it's super fun. It's 2 days, tons of content, 6 stages, and it's an absolute blast. And if you want behind the scenes, if you want to meet Robert Kiyosaki, Danielle DiMartino Booth, Rick Rule, whoever, we have tons and tons of speakers there, then grab a VIP ticket. It gets you access to a whole bunch of behind the scenes activations, including the super coveted private keynote speakers, cocktail party, very intimate, small gathering at a little restaurant. And what's super cool about this is that, you may be a junior mining investor and you watch all this content on my channel, your channel, and many others, and you want to meet Rick Rule in person, or Andy Scheckman in person, or David Rosenberg, and all these folks. Let me tell you, like at the show, they're super keen to chat, right? That's what they're there for. I'm adamant. They don't do their talk and leave. They're on the floor all day, both days, and they're engaging. But I mean it sincerely. They love answering questions. And whenever you see Rick on the floor, he's surrounded by people just, having a chat, asking questions, getting insight, all this stuff. VRICmedia.com for tickets, VRICmedia.com.
I'll make sure to link to that in the post that comes with this audio and video as well. But Jake, thank you for sharing that. And thank you for taking time out of your day. I appreciate it's sometimes always a bit fun to be the other side of a microphone. So thank you for sharing everything today. And I look forward to catching up next year.
It was really fun chatting with you, Robert. I appreciate it.